Welcome to this session to the IFPH Explorers. My name is Jimena Perry. Good morning from the United States. Good morning in Europe. Welcome everybody, and I'm very happy to see you here. Today we're going to have an event on performing and public history. We're going to have a conversation with David Dean and Thorsten Logge. Logan. I'll do my best. David Dean's new book, Performing Public History, Case Studies in Historical Storytelling, was published last year by Routledge. And in that book, he argues that bringing the past to life through non-traditional media, such as theater and film, living history performances, puppetry, operas, and video games, invites us to rethink how we do history work and why. In this event, he and Thorsten, who like David has worked with theater professionals in bringing history to the stage and uses performativity as a key concept for his theoretical work, will discuss themes such as historical accuracy, on authenticity, fact and fiction, and the value of adopting creative methodologies. So our guests are David Dean. He's a distinguished research professor in history at Carleton University. Now retired, he taught British history and public history at Carleton from 1999 to 2024 and was co-director of the Carleton Centre for Public History. His publications include History and Memory and Performance from 2015, A Companion to Public History from 2018, Migration and Stereotypes in Performance and Culture from 2020, Public Historians and Participatory Public History in Public and Public History in 2021, and most recently Performing Public History in 2025. He's currently co-editing In Granite and Bronze, a guide to the monuments of the National Capital Region, forthcoming in 2027, and trying to find time to write The Challenge of Public History for the Cambridge Element series. David has 3 ongoing public-facing projects: community-based storytelling through street installations, for which he won the Historical Society of Ottawa's Francois Bregha Storytelling Award in 2025, the public history of postage stamps, and negotiating diasporic memories and identities through food. David also has served on the steering committee of the International Federation for Public History for 2 terms and co-edits the journal International Public History. Thorsten Logge is a professor of public history at the University of Hamburg, Germany. He studied history, political sciences, and psychology at the Universities of Hamburg and Gießen. His doctoral thesis on the medial construction of the nation, the Schiller Centennial Celebrations 1859 in Europe and North America, widened his perspective of academic historiography to cultural history and eventually public history. After returning from Gießen to Hamburg in 2010, Logan developed and established the public history unit at the history department. He became assistant professor of public history at the University of Hamburg in 2017. His position was unexpectedly made permanent and transferred into associate professorship in 2024. Logan is head of the new public history master program at the University of Hamburg. His research interests are public history as a research-oriented academic subdiscipline, mediality and performativity, and doing history in the Battle of Atlanta and Battle of Gettysburg cycloramas from the 1800s to today. He's also working tirelessly on his book, Stereotypes, which has already been postponed several times, but will be out finally in 2027. So after that presentation, I will start the conversation with a question. If somebody in the audience would like to post a question, I invite you to write it in the chat or just open your mic. So David, why did you feel compelled to write Performing Public History?
Well, I feel like it had the same journey that Thorsten's book is having. It was a long time in coming in many ways, and then was written in a fairly short period of time. But I realized to my horror, it was 20 years ago now, that I was invited to be an insider with the National Theatre Company in Ottawa. And I worked for 6 years on various productions with that company. And I've been working with actors and directors and playwrights ever since. So when I got involved with performing history on stage in particular, I'd always been open to non-traditional forms of history writing, so writing history in film, video games, and so on. But this was the first time I'd actually been an insider in the production process, and I learned a huge amount and decided that um, that I wanted to share it. And there were three things in particular that struck me. One, or that sort of compelled me to write it. One of them was that I was really tired of my colleagues dismissing non-traditional forms of history writing, so history and dance, history and film, whatever, because they weren't as good as a monograph. And I was very tired of the monograph being the benchmark for good history writing. And that I thought that we need to evaluate these forms of producing the writing history on their own terms and with their own criteria, as well as their validity as history, if you like. It secondly also emphasized for me the increasingly the inadequacy. Well, it problematized the assumptions that I'd been trained with, which was that the best way of doing history was distanced objectivity, and that doing performance really brought in a lot of emotions, a lot of senses, a lot of creativity, and that the project of history is not retrieval; it's a creative process. And there are a lot of synergies between what was happening in the theater and what I was doing as a historian. It's just that I didn't have the courage to admit it and didn't make it open and transparent. And I started to see value in that. And then thirdly, because I was interested in these non-traditional forms of history and seeing them as having great value, and because I was beginning to critique the training I had in historical objectivity, it led me on a journey to explore other forms of history writing. And by writing, I should do that, I guess. But in dance and in drumming and in puppetry and in across a range of cultures, which challenge the notion of what history is, why we do it, how we do it, what we value when we do it, but also, I think, challenge public history, because this notion that public history has gone international from a sort of northern global north center is problematic when you encounter cultures who've been dancing history for generations on generations, or drumming history for generations, or doing it through puppetry or storytelling. So I think there's this sort of rebounding on both the discipline of history, but also the field of public history that I found. So I guess I wanted to share that, and I'd been sharing it in the classroom for many years, and I wanted to share it more publicly. And ironically, I wrote a book, which is sort of weird, rather than perform it. But anyway, that's.
I don't know if you can see the book here. Maybe, okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, David. You both share a history of working with theater professionals. How did this influence your work as a historian? Thorsten, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I can start, and I can kind of jump back a little to how I came to this topic too, if you want me to, because I'm working with theater professionals because I'm a professor at the German history department, and I have 14 colleagues doing theater here on the floor, and in class and on stages and stuff like that. So my approach coming to, and of course I worked with theater people who put sources on stage in scenic readings and documentary theater. So this is one thing that I do for years now. But I just want to add something to what David just told you about how to come to such a topic first, if that's okay. So for me, it's the Schiller Centennial celebrations of 1859. So my doctoral thesis was really changed my life to public history, because what I wanted to do first was to explain how the bourgeois in Germany expressed their own ideas of the nation, of the German nation, in the Schiller Centennial celebrations. But what I found out is that there is no representation of the nation in the Schiller Centennial celebrations, but the celebrations did the nations. So they did the nation by celebrating it, and by celebrating it, it came into life because people did something in common they could later then refer to. So this was my approach coming to this point, and that changed my work as a whole. And after that, I never got out of that again. Because if you understand that doing history or doing something on stage is very much in common, then you understand that history as a profession is something that follows rules and regulation on certain stages, and that the stages within universities are situated in rooms that can be seen as theaters, as specific theaters. And this is my way to that. And after that, I just came to work with theater people in a project that was called, how do they call it in English? In German, it's Geschichte im Rampenlicht. I think it's staging sources or something like that, but I put a link in here if you want me to a book that we published at De Gruyter. Unfortunately, it's mostly German, but maybe you can translate that for yourself, or if you know some German people, or you just want to learn German, it's an opportunity to do that with this book. Because what they do in Bremen, which is a university nearby Hamburg, they do research projects in local history. Then they produce a corpus of sources, they give it to the Shakespeare Company in Bremen, and the Shakespeare Company puts it on stage as a scenic reading to different topics. And there I came to work with these people, and one of them is now my colleague here in Hamburg, working with me for at least the next 20 years, which is great. And what we developed there was an idea that if we take performativity honestly, not only as a research approach to understand events in the past that have some performative aspects, but to understand what we do, then historiography becomes a practice that has so much in common with what people do on stages in theaters. And what, as David just said, then we are all kind of theatrical or performance professionals, bringing not only history on stage in certain media formats, but ourselves too as historians, because you cannot only produce a historiography, you also produce the historian doing this historiography. And this is how my connection is to that. I hope this somehow answers part of the question. Otherwise, please just follow up with more.
David. You're muted, David.
There we go. Sorry, it kept on opening a different window for some reason. Yeah, that's a perfect introduction to my thinking about it, because I think the first thing that struck me was just how much synergy there is and how much similarity there is in the work that people were doing in theater. And it was not just the dramaturg, it was the director, the assistant director, the creative team, the stage managers, the designers, but the actors, working really intimately with actors, how they research their backstories, how they research their characters. There was, and it was no different than what I did as a historian. Well, it was different because they had like 3 weeks to do it, whereas I had a long time to do it. It wasn't archivally centered in the way that mine was, and they weren't aware of historiography in the way that I was. But it was very fact-driven, I guess, in a sense. But it was also very, very rich and very profound, and it was very citational. I mean, the sort of documentary theater or the verbatim theater that Thorsten was involved in, where you put documents on stage. I mean, some of the theorists are writing about that. The theater people say, well, we're just using the documents. That's all we're doing. But, and no, you're not. What you're doing is you're streaming it together, you're putting it together, you're adding narrative, you're creating it. It's not just straight verbatim, even when you're quoting verbatim from something. And the gestures you use, the movement you use, the tone you use, all of that is inventing in a good way. It's an exploration, it's creating in a good way. And then it dawned, and I was very, so here I am. And then I realized, yeah, that's what I do when I write history. That's what I'm doing when I'm writing my monographs. I do exactly the same thing, but I just don't admit it. And so I need to sort of wrestle with that and put myself front and center in the work that I do and say, well, this is why I'm doing it this way. And this is why I chose to privilege this story over this story in my writing, or why I gave priority, or this perspective. Point of view and perspective was really important on stage, like who, where, or on film, where, you know, where the camera moves, where is it looking, who, where, when you're watching a dance performance on stage, how are they relating to each other? That's really important. But also, what is the audience seeing and how that is happening? And I realized that was all true also of the way we write history, the creativity in rewriting and researching. And then, of course, you know, the validation of using your imagination, of not the freedom from the archive that people had, the freedom from the documents to create and to reimagine, was also something that I realized had been there in history for ages, but it had been marginalized by the sort of sense that there's a proper way of doing history and an improper way. And the synergies were with the so-called improper way. So who is the performer was a question I was always witnessing in the theater. And who are we as historians, as Thorsten said? And why are we not making that visible and transparent? I think that's really important. I guess the other thing I learned from theater, from working in theater, that changed my view too, is that audiences are not passive, readers are not passive. They're participants in the performances of the past. And as Boal would say, Augusto Boal, the Brazilian theorist, you know, that this notion of the spectator, right? That spectators are not passive; they're actually part of the act. And I think readers are the same of our monographs, and so on. So I think paying attention to audience was also something that I learned, and that blew away the notion of that you can do things that works for the audience, even though by other criteria that wouldn't be the right thing to do as a historian, right? And I share a couple of stories of that in the book, where you actually have to be historically inaccurate, unfaithful, or not fully responsibly citational to the archive, and limit yourself to that, bound yourself with that, in order to capture something authentic about what you're trying to say about the past for an audience. And that becomes much more audience-centered. So yeah, history-centered, historian-centered, I think is important. As Thorsten says, I think also audience, and thinking about audience-centered, and that the performance space is collaborative in a way, and it's not top-down history. It's more of a collaborative space. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Talking about audiences, I mean, that puts it into two perspectives that are discussed theoretically by Jorma Kallela. One perspective saying that what we do is addressee-related communication. So we always think about the addressees of what we do and the format in which we do history, and the addressees who are then we speak to. It doesn't matter what format we use, are different, and that we need to just stick to the rules and regulation that function in that communication. And on the other hand, you have Marco Demantowski in Public History in Schools saying that public history is a past-related identity discourse, which also means that you have an audience that you are talking to. Okay, it's more kind of a different audience. It's not that linear that you talk to these people, but it's if you want to acquire membership, if you want to be recognized for your stories, for your own identity as a person, but also as an individual and as a group member, then of course you have to address audiences, and they have to acknowledge your narratives as appropriate for being a member in that group. So in this together, and then David's book is just building up kind of a theoretical framework that makes me happy to analyze others doing history. One last example here, if I look at my panorama painters from the 19th century, and I just try to understand how do they do their 360 degrees round images they put as a entertainment history into urban environments, they go on research. They go into archives, they go to museums, they talk to contemporary witnesses, they go to the field of the battle and learn about the topography, and then they try to paint something that audiences acknowledge as okay history. And if they don't, which happens for the Battle of Gettysburg, we know that people are writing, hey, you have to put up General Meade's headquarters a little more bigger, it's more important, and you have to show that. And then the painter, Paul-Philippe Otto, answers, no, you can't do that because you can't see that from that perspective, from that viewpoint. And then the people who finance the thing say, yeah, but that people buy the box office tickets, you got to paint that bigger. And then later they just change the picture and the image so that the audience is okay with what they are being shown. Which doesn't mean that we don't need facts, by the way. And I just want to add that we don't push away facts here, because facts are a discursive thing too.
Right. Yeah. That resonates a lot with what I've been reading about and hearing about with people who design video games, right? That there's points of getting the story right, but there's things that people expect to happen, and that you have to balance that or adjust it, or it's not balance. I hate using that word. But it's you have to adjust and change for the audience, for the player, as well as for what. And I think what's really exciting about that is you're testing your own limits. Like, how far will you go as a historian in making those accommodations, if you like, or those adjustments or whatever. I don't even mean that, because that suggests there's a center that has to be adjusted. And I don't, but you know what I mean by that, that there's a flexibility that needs to happen. And how far will you go with that flexibility? And then the need to reflect on that choice. Why am I finding that challenging, but I didn't find this challenging so why is it a problem when you have that headquarters up there? Why am I finding that difficult? Just because you couldn't see it from that perspective? But if you're in that perspective, you might be imagining it in your head that it was over there. So why not capture that imaginary moment?
Right.
But,
and in the Battle of Gettysburg, there's a wounded Abraham Lincoln in the painting, when he was not even at the battlefield when the battle happens. But it was important for the painters to have him in there because it says something.
Right. Yeah.
This conversation has made me think about my own teaching. I ask my students for the final projects not to write an essay. I'm getting away from essays, but to produce other kind of product, like a video. Last semester I had a dance. The first time I had a choreography, it was awesome, Esther. It was awesome. It was about women's rights in Latin America. It was great. But then other professors told me, okay, that's great, but how are you going to evaluate if they learned or not? And I thought, I couldn't answer the question because I wasn't expecting it. But then I thought, we are still thinking in the monograph, the objectives, like everything, like very square thinking. Now I know how to answer it better, but I think we still need to work on that, because I think monographs and being faithful to sources and stuff like that, we are not actually learning from that. We are actually just repeating stuff. So I think this book and this conversation is really important for that. So following.
Oh, wait.
Yeah. You go first, Thorsten.
Okay, I know that question you're asking, because academic text and articles and monographs is still the thing to go for, and what we and our students have to learn, what we have to teach. And I'm pretty aware now that the monograph and the academic article in written text was one of the most important media formats and most actual media formats being used in the time when our profession has been built up. So this is a 19th century medium that was really fancy at that time. But that's quite some years away. So maybe we could just ask ourselves, shouldn't we, as our ancestors, as Ranke, as Zübel and others did, why shouldn't we use the medium that is most actual now for just putting our messages out? They did. Why should we stick to their medium when they used something new and something appropriate?
Yeah, that's spot on, because we're sort of straitjacketed by this notion that this is a proper way of doing history, and forgetting the fact that before Ranke, before all of that positivism and empiricism and stuff that took over the discipline, there were other forms. I mean, there was history painting in the 18th and 19th century. There were, Sir Walter Scott, or on the one hand, or Carlyle or Michelet, And as you go back in time, the people writing history in various ways that were considered to be not only legitimate, but the whole sentimental history of the 18th century and all of that stuff. That you wanted to stimulate the emotions, because what was the point of writing history if you didn't make people cry or make people angry or make it come alive? And doing that through opera, or doing it through dance, or doing it through theater, that was all happening. And then I mean, Italian operas of the 1830s on Tudor England. I mean, what's going on there? What emotions is that bringing? So, I think, yeah, not. We've been forced into this straitjacket. Now we're in a world of social media. We're in a world of AI. We're in a world of where everyone is performing in various ways. Reenactments have old history. I know living history has old history, but it's much bigger now. It's much more popular. And we know from all the surveys in public history that that's where publics engage with, taking photographs and watching film and so on. So so why are we not embracing that in academia? I think we slowly are. I know in my department, and Kira's from my department knows this well, that we are slowly coming to terms with that. I think I'd say that the digital history has been really important for that process, that producing history digitally has become more legitimate. And my colleague Sean at Carleton and I fought for many years, along with the other public historians, to get these non-traditional forms of history recognized as being and recognized as not only valuable but also validated. It comes down to very specific things too. Like I've been on our university's tenure and promotion, and people are asking me, well, this person produced an exhibit, this person produced a documentary film. But how do we value that in relation to this person who did 2 articles? And we literally started to map out equivalences of that. Well, an exhibit is equivalent to a monograph in terms of the research and the production and so on. And that helps people who are nervous about this. It gives them a little template. So back to evaluation, because I found that. I mean, I had a student dance her thesis for me, and you do not want to see me on a dance floor. I have no idea about what I was evaluating. So how do I evaluate dance? How do I evaluate an original music composition? I had a student who knitted her thesis, literally knitted. Well, I don't knit. I don't know the difference of stitches and so on. I know there's a language of knitting. And so being in theater made me feel really nervous, because I now understood, being in theater, what the process is. I took a filmmaking course. I understood about mise en scène and different shots and so on. Felt more comfortable evaluating that. Dance, knitting, origami. I had a student do origami as I just don't know how to evaluate those things. So there's 2 things I'd say about it. One is that there's lots of resources out there to help you evaluate those things. Secondly, you learn from your students. I mean, my student had been a knitter for 15 years of her life, since she was 5. She could teach me, and she taught me the difference of the stitches. Same with the ones who did graphic novels. I read graphic novels. I don't know the different shapes and forms and language of it. They taught me that language to help evaluate it. And there's colleagues in music, in film studies, and other departments who've been in music and performance studies and dance and so on, who have done this. They've done these evaluations. So connecting with them helps a lot. Bizarrely, I found connections with engineers, because engineering students make things, and those things have to be assessed. And so the language of assessment, that. But the key thing for me, Jimena, was to ask students to keep a diary, or to evaluate and write a discussion about the choices they made. And so that made visible their subjectivities, why I chose this and not that, why that would have meant this happen, and this would have meant this happen. In fact, I think this didn't work very well, what I produced, and I wish I'd done that. But I'm not judging the product. The problem with the article and the book and the essay is that we judge it by a criteria of, good, excellent, whatever. When you get students to do non-traditional forms, if it doesn't work, that doesn't actually matter. If it's a failed experience. That doesn't matter. It's the journey that the student took and the journey that they took you along with. That's what matters. That's where the critical thinking happens. That's where the critical engagement happens. And that comes through in the reflection paper, I call it, that we get people to write, or just in discussion, a one-on-one discussion about the choices you make. And so there are really good answers to that worry about evaluation and criteria, both from the promotion tenure aspect as academics, but also I think in terms of the student evaluation with colleagues who are terrified, and
Yes.
some of them are really and also very judgmental. Well,
Yes.
if you want to do frivolous history, go do a course with him because he'll let you dance your thesis.
Yes.
And it's yeah.
I've had
Esther.
that before, Esther. I've had that answer, like, historians, we don't do posters, because I ask them sometimes to do academic posters. Like, we don't do posters, we write. And I'm like, no, we can also do other stuff. Esther, please go.
I'm so encouraged hearing both of you mention today how you've worked with students doing different forms of media with history, and there's sort of different ways of assessing it. And things like that. One thing that particularly struck me that I would really just like to know more about is whether these are students who are solely focused on history or public history in their studies. I feel like for my own sort of limited work with students, they can actually find it difficult to engage and think creatively. And that's partly due to, there's maybe a few reasons why, but if I've worked with theatre students, they work with history. Like, it's common sense to work with history if you're a theatre student, and sort of do those sort of creative medium and creative tasks. So I just wondered whether these students that you're talking about are actually like single honours in like the British sense of the word, and they're prepared to do this work, or actually are they already coming with sort of an interdisciplinary lens to it?
Did you want to answer first, Thorsten? Right.
Yes, I can, because our experience is little too low because we just started our program and we just opened up the option to do a creative format, which was a hell of a fight with our administration. And because it's complicated. If you have a program where you want to assess students and you want to just have it properly done so they can later do a PhD after the masters, then you have to deal with administrations who have their own ways of performing stuff. And so our idea was then to give them something they can work with and open up rooms and fields. So what we did is saying that you can write your classical master thesis, even if a student you feel uncomfortable doing creative stuff because you don't want to close doors, you just do the classical master thesis, no problem. But if you're going crazy, nuts, or whatever you want to call it, maybe just creative, then you can do another thing and then have the creative reflection on that, which is put in text. And this text form allows us to open the other space. So what we can do is, you can write a song if you want to and have the reflection in kind of the way David just explained to us. And then the reflection is being graded and the song is not. Because I may understand songwriting a little, but I don't understand the art of songwriting this person is just presenting. But what I understand is the reflection and how it's been done. And if I do this and do the grading on the reflection and let the other thing be as it is, then students can go and engage and be creative. And my experience is students are creative, but they are disciplined by the BA system that makes them being disciplined in their discipline. And to reopen this is complicated because you have 3 to 5 years as a BA student being disciplined, and how to reopen this is really crazy in a master that has 2 years. So what we can do is we have rooms, we open spaces, we are open persons, and then students come in and dance or they don't. So that's okay for us. But maybe David, because we had a PhD thesis together in some years ago, maybe that's a good example on how to combine all these elements.
Yeah, so we have a PhD program in public history as well, which allows a performance element. And I talk about Rick's work a little bit in the book. he was an actor who became a historian and actor, director, theatre person. And he did a whole series of oral history interviews in a northern Ontario town called Sudbury, where there had been 3 major strikes and different stories told about those strikes, about why they failed or why they succeeded. So he did a lot of oral history interviews, amazing work, recorded the interviews, wrote them up, replayed them back to people, and there's this sort of recycling that always happened, this reassembling always happened. But then he wrote a script and he produced a play, and the play was performed in a hall that was familiar to many people in the town. And then the audiences were often made of people who'd been interviewed or not interviewed or were part of the community. And so they witnessed the performance, and then he would readjust it. So I'm hoping the script will become a book, I hope, but I hope he'll write a book out of the whole thesis as well. And it was an amazing project, and it's one of the most enjoyable events I've ever had in my academic career was driving up to Sudbury with his co-supervisor. We drove up to evaluate his work on site in the performance, and anyway, as well as, but then he had to write it up as a thesis. And so then there's the very traditional elements of the thesis. There's the traditional historiographical element, there's a traditional background element, context elements, and so on, and then engagements with the script and reflections on the script and what worked and what didn't, and so on. So it's a very, overall as a package, it was a very profound thing because it combined this creativity with the sort of traditional forms of historical evaluation. So I think, yeah, it's a unique example as far as I know for a PhD thesis yet, of at least in our program, just in our program. The students, that's a great question because, Esther, because when I began teaching, and there's a chapter in the book on the students' work from this, basically the book was recentered on this course that I was teaching, the seminar I was teaching, and Kira is one of the amazing students in that seminar. Initially, the students were history students and public history students, many public history students. And then a few history students would come in. And that was interesting because why the traditional history students would come into this public history performance class. And the reason they came in is because they were tired of just writing essays. They had these other forms that they experienced. For example, playing video games or watching historical films or being historical documentary nerds on television or whatever. Theater, some of them had theater backgrounds and so on. And they wanted to have an opportunity to play out the work that they'd been doing in essays in a different form, a form that they felt confident about because they had a lot of experience of doing it, right? And they had a professor who, when the professor demonstrated some of these things, showed incredible inability and utter failure. Like watching me play a historical video game. We had a session once where I played Assassin's Creed, and the room was just falling about in laughter. I mean, talk about de-empowering yourself and decentering yourself, because I was terrible at it, right? And so, but they were very skilled at it, but they were also skilled at then writing a gaming brief, and so creating their own video game, creating their own scenarios based on that experience, a deep experience, which was way deeper than my experience. So word got out, and then suddenly I was getting students from another university's theater department were coming in to take the seminar. And then art history students were coming in because they wanted to draw. Film studies students started to come in because they realized that. So then for 2 or 3 years, I had this, it was taught every other year, I had this incredible group of students, history majors, English lit majors, art history. Major isn't quite the right word because we don't do that at the MA level, but they're focused on one thing with a minor. And, they were just, and so the synergy in the room was extraordinary, and the support for each other. But then the other thing that happened is that a lot of people have these, there's one woman who danced a French treatise that was written on dance from the 18th century. But she wanted to explore his his instructions because he wrote for male bodies, of course, and she wanted to explore this with a female body. And so while she was doing this, there was this commentary that she was saying about, no, this movement doesn't work for me. It was just like she's having this argument with this 18th century manual. I think it was 18th century. Anyway, just why am I saying that? Oh, because she'd been dancing since she was 6. So she had this extraordinary skill level that she had, and she felt suddenly open to something, as this is going back to what Thorsten said, things that had been suppressed and oppressed, and said, that's not history. Well, oh no, we don't do that. You have to suppress all that, those emotions and those senses and that excitement, and I'll take that away, suppress it. Suddenly we're opening that up, and enabling them to do something that people felt really centered and strong about. So writing history from a position of strength, as opposed to writing history from a position where you're still feeling like you're an apprentice because your professor has been in the archive for years or has written books and articles, and you're just writing an essay, and you're right. So that it also rebalanced the classroom in a really exciting way. But it was a problem, and I don't want to pretend that it wasn't. I mean, there were problems that I had with other faculty coming and maybe complaining a bit about what was happening. The students would find, like, I would insist, that English. I feel bad because I was at Goldsmiths for 11 years, and the dance department was right next door to me, and I discovered this long afterwards, and sometimes I wish I was back there, but. One of the things that would happen is that I would suggest, for example, that I really insist that you don't distance yourself from your own work. So instead of saying, well, one could argue this, which is a very English way of distancing yourself from and not taking ownership, I'd say, no, you want to say, I think this, and this is why I think it. But then people would use that in another class and get told off and have said, you can't do that. That's not right. We don't use the personal pronouns. We don't take owner. We don't do that. That's not what historians do. So then I wasn't really doing history properly, and I was leading students down this really non-historical disciplinary pathway that was invalid and problematic. And, so there's that tension as well. But the refuge was those people from other departments and other disciplines who said, wow, that's cool. I didn't know you were doing that sort of work in history, from music colleagues or art history colleagues or theater colleagues. And so it opened up those connections too. But sometimes I felt more at home in those departments than I did at times in my own department, but outside the public history group. But yeah. So yeah, a very long answer to a mixture of students, but starting with public history who are open already to non-traditional forms of writing the past, historians coming in because they wanted to have some enjoyment of that, and then other disciplines coming in, so that I ended up, when I finished teaching the class, with this incredible mix of students from various disciplines. And I don't know if you could do that at York or in other places in the UK, whether that would be. Yeah.
I think one of the key words you mentioned, David, is enjoyment. When you shift to non-traditional ways of evaluating or creating or writing history, the students have more fun. And I think that's awesome. When I tell them no essays, they go like, they like us, like, okay, they're a little bit relieved, but okay. The next question has to do is building on this, but I would like both of you to elaborate a little bit more. Why do you think it's important for historians to embrace their subjectivities, imaginations, emotions, senses, and experiences? Thorsten, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go short by saying because we're humans and we should act as such, but I could also say that we cannot escape our subjectivities. We cannot escape our imaginations. We cannot escape our backpacks that we're carrying with us because of our socialization and our own personal biographical histories that we carry with us. So if you go to a museum, um, it does matter who the person is that goes to that museum and what you carry with you. This is what makes you see things and what you makes you ignore other things in general. So if I go to engage with some narration of the past, it will be different than any of us here in the room will have, because you have other experience, you have other histories, you have other things that you have in mind or in your hearts. So knowing this, and knowing from more the constructivist theory of the last, let's say, 50 years or so, and longer, we can say that our way to see the world, to make it meaningful to us, has something to do with our subjectivity. And it doesn't stop, even if you learn rules and regulation, how to be an objective narrator. So the rules and regulations make you think about your subjectivities. They make you capable to make it transparent and to talk about this, but you can't escape it. So the way how we learn, or as I learned in a German university in the history department, to exclude my personality from doing history, makes me think that excluding this makes it invalid for me, or at least it makes it complicated. So what I do, since I understood that, and that came from theatrical engagement. So I learned a lot from the Institute for Applied Theater Studies in Gießen, which I did not attend, but I learned about through theater performances from René Polish and others, who made theory a thing on stage, and they made theory, general theories of all kinds, part of their plays, so that people could engage with that without being theorists or without having studied it all. This made me think that my own subjectivity, my own perspective on the world enables me to speak to certain audiences in a way that I understand, and I should use that and make transparent that I do. And this is what I think is important for me, that we have to learn about our subjectivities, we have to learn about our imaginations, our emotions, and why they work as such, make transparent why we do work with them and how we do work with them, and then make them part of our reflections. That doesn't make us non-scientists, because reflecting this and still using the reference systems we learned about puts this into a scientific work. And this is what I think why it's important to do it. And I see David nodding here.
Yeah, I would have answered similarly, but not so eloquently. I think it's very important to acknowledge who we are and where we're coming from, and how this informs our history work and our imaginations when we're in the archive, or how we're putting things together in our writing, how it shapes our perspectives, but I think important as well, what I learned with theater is that all of those energies that are coming together like that, and acknowledging that and making it transparent and making it visible, it's engaging with a purpose, and it's acknowledging the consequence of those choices and the purpose of those choices. And that it really challenges this sort of distance, top down, almost arrogant assumption that this is the right way and the only way. And it opens up multiple perspectives and different points of engagement with those different perspectives, because you're saying, this is me, I'm a historian, I'm performing in my archival work, I'm performing in my writing, and this is who I am and where I'm coming from. And I found that that's really important, because it acknowledges our privileges as academic historians, and our privileges as coming from the global north in terms of our power and our perceptives, and acknowledging that. And I think that makes us relatable to everyone. And in this age, I think this is really important at this historical moment where AI is generating false histories, and where false histories are being, spoken by politicians and determining policy and so on. And saying, no, that's factually incorrect isn't working anymore. What's working is saying, this is me, I'm a historian, I have this knowledge, this is where I'm coming from, this is what I'm putting forward. And you need to take me seriously in this. I'm not judging you in the same way but there needs to be this engagement, this discussion. So I think it's learning transparency. It's honest. I think it's honest. I think it's more transparent. I think it's better history than this sort of distanced objectivity, this claim, this retreat into the retrieval of the archive, denying our creativity, denying that we use our imagination, denying that we connect the dots, and that's the dots that are important, not the connection. This is what Michelet talked about, right? It's the connecting that is actually where the history is happening, not the dots. And when you think of, say, de Hartmann and critical fabulation and all of those sorts of things, this is where this is valid. I agree with you, Thorsten. You put it beautifully. This is scientific. It's just a different way of doing it. This is valid and has value.
Yeah, and the validity, what is valid depends on the people you are talking to, and it depends on
Yeah.
how you talk. So what David and I had in another conversation before this meeting is, and that's really interesting, what even is the archive doing with what I can tell as a historian? So the archive is a certain way to preserve certain knowledge, certain information, and how to access them and how to present and work with them. So this kind of having information in the classical archive is one way to talk about the archive. Me coming from a working class family, I know other kinds of archive and people talking in different ways because they have other things they deem to be their archive and their emotions, knowledge, experiences, and they drive them or they pull their information from these archives. These are not buildings, these are communities. And so if we first, as historians, we need to say, okay, there's an archive that has been built in a certain time for a certain purpose, and it has certain material in it, and we have learned how to use this material to produce valid historiography. Great, let's learn that, and then we can use it if we want to, but we have to understand how it works, that's important, and we can then decide that this may not be the way to do history in each and every way, and we can then decide to say, yeah, that's interesting, let's do a dance here. Why not? So to know all the categories, to know different rules and regulations enables us to have a broader option to tell our stories.
That intangible archive and the memory body, and across generations, the stories that are told. I talk a little bit in the book about food, about, we cook these recipes, but is it the same as grandma's recipe or grandpa's recipe? Well, there's a big discussion about these traditions that go back. We were talking about our working class backgrounds and how, there's forms of knowledge, privileging other forms of knowledge, other ways of knowing, I think is one of the things that doing performances, public history as performance, I think that's what really comes through at the end, is that it not only accepts, but actually privileges and acknowledges the importance of these other ways of knowing, these other ways of storytelling. And maybe I could just jump in and I mean, Kira's taken this even further, and she's now doing this blended writing projects with the archive to sort of, do you want to talk a little bit about that, since this is being recorded and other people can, and there's a great article in Rethinking History that Kira's written that I think should be compulsory for anyone interested in performance in public history. Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot and you just had a gulp of coffee, but your cat's there for inspiration, I can see in the background. So
yes, and she I think mewed in support. Sorry, being put on the spot, I'm a little
sorry.
No, it's okay. It's interesting because I'm just gonna be like hyper specific to what I was doing this morning. I'm starting a new project that's gonna be a speculative biography, hi Cleo, on a girl who lived her childhood across several different institutions. And I'm thinking a lot about Lee Edelman's No Futurity and Alison Kafer's Crip Queer Future. I'm forgetting the title right now. So I've been doing this sort of reading and thinking about this project, and I've written a preface for it inspired by Alison Kafer, where I've sort of situated my own girlhood as a girl born to a teenaged unwed mother who was someone who had no future. And I introduce that a little bit and then talk about why I was drawn to Lily based on being two girls at different times with no futures. And we're, we lived very different lives at very different times. But there's something about these experiences across time that I think are worth highlighting. And for me, this sort of preface brings to life that subjectivity and why I want to talk about Lily and why we're writing this speculative history about Lily as a means to talk about girlhood from histories that are absent from the archives. And she's more present because of the institutional records, but none of it is from her perspective. And so taking these pieces alongside other primary sources and other secondary literature allows me to do that like connections of the dots work. And at the end of the day, all history is never going to be exactly what truly, really happened. It's about the method that we're doing it. And so for me, this is like my current project on speculative biography and Lily. But I've done other things around like fiction writing as well. And David's referencing my article in Rethinking History that talks about writing this sort of like fictional novella for my master's about a woman who spends decades at the Brockville Asylum here in Ontario, Canada.
Yeah. Sorry to put you on the spot. That was
That's
great.
okay. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, it's great.
Oh, it was a great putting you in the spot, Kira. Congratulations. So, Thorsten, can you tell us more about your work on historical reenactments? Does it speak to any of these issues?
Yeah, it does. Kind of. I'm not really working on reenactments as a reenactment researcher. That is more the work of my colleague Juliane Thoman from Regensburg, who I really encourage you to take a look at her work. She's a really great colleague. But what I do is I like the idea of enacting history by doing it. And so what I take from reenactments is the theoretical approach to think about what we do when we do history in different media forms and format. So I had some discussions with Freddie Rokem, who I can really recommend you as a theater historian and theater theoretical man, thinking about how we can access the past by reenacting events in, for him it's theater, for me it's historiography and other formats. And I don't believe in reenacting the original events. So what I can do is talk about that we use the past in the present, and the present can be historicized. That's for sure, but it's a different thing. So I cannot have the event that I enact be back on stage, whatever that stage is. But what I can do is I can use references to the past to engage in the present to a certain point that's political, psychological, individual, whatever, and then use the past as a means of discourse. And the interesting thing here is I can use it in different ways. And this enacting or having an event that does an event, so the event I reference is used in the event when I do it, that's an interesting thing for me as a historian to understand, that the present of doing history is always important, that it's not only the present of the event that I refer to, but even the event in which I do it needs to be contextualized. So it's a really important matter of doing history research on, let's say, oh dear, Jimena, I hope you have some water nearby.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I was muted.
No, it's okay. I just want to just hand over, but it's really complicated by, well, anyways. So if you have like theater, scenic readings, or documentary theater about the Nazi past in Germany in the 60s, it's not only about the Nazi past of Germany, but it's about the not discussing Nazi past in the 60s. So this double-sided reenacting, this is, for me, this is the most important thing to do in public history, to understand that we have several layers where the past and the present come together, and that we, looking back on past events that do public history, are again kind of another historical layer that needs to be analyzed, understood, and then used for us, because we are not doing this just without any purpose. If we tend to look at past events doing history, we also have a contemporary reason to do that. If I look at documentary theater dealing with Nazi past in the 60s, today I have a reason for that, and this reason needs to be reflected too. So this is my approach to using the reenactment thing as a transfer from theater to the real world, to then doing history in different forms and formats. And reenactment is kind of a theatrical performance in any ways.
Thank you, Thorsten. I apologize again for my cough. I'm recovering from a nasty cold. Okay, thank you. David, why did you want to share your students' work with readers? Why an appendix offering some classroom exercises in the book we're talking about today?
Oh, well, I think Esther's question earlier sort of helped with that, answer that. I think it's partly because just for all the things that we've talked about, the things that Thorsten just talked about, that the present is in the past, but the past is also the present. So part of our task is to give the past its present back, but also to acknowledge the pastness of our own present, if that makes any sense. I mean, going back to Freddie Rokem or performance studies scholars like Checkner, the notion that there's a doubleness, that there's many originals, right? And there's not just one referential original, that there's many different originals, and that they're all need to be engaged with. All of that I wanted to share in the classroom. I wanted to share it, basically. I thought it was really cool, very important. Challenged some of the ways we were doing history and teaching it at universities. It offered a way of knowing that was different from the top-down academic way, distanced, so-called objective way of doing knowledge, and it was a more bottom-up approach to ways of understanding things. And I wanted to share that, but also maybe encourage students to think outside the box and to think differently, and to give them opportunities to think about the role of the senses and the role of emotions and the role of the imagination and creativity. And I was being selfish about it as well, because I knew that students had all these skills from just endless conversation with students, where we'd end up talking about the video games they were doing, or the painting they were doing, or the dancing they were doing, or the drumming they were doing, or whatever, these other extracurricular activities. I wanted to make these extracurricular activities part of the curriculum and part of the classroom agenda. And they had skills that I didn't, and I wanted to see how that played out when they actually were really able to run with that. And the exercises thing was partly to just reinforce some of the things that. So I share some of those stories in the book, and and it's sort of like, you give people a little thing, and then they give you something really much more profound back. And I've rarely have there were moments where I got very emotional and I actually cried a few times at some of these performances that students did. We were able to stage the performances, and people told stories, or they did what they were doing, or they videoed it or whatever. And as Kara knows, some of those performances were really powerful because they were often very deeply personal stories. There were things that people needed to work out, and they felt that we'd created a safe enough space in the classroom to work those things out and bring them out. So it was all of that. The exercises is basically for colleagues who are nervous about all of this and don't know how you can do this in the classroom, and to sort of give people to re-gift in a way. It's sort of like a Christmas re-gifting, because most of the exercises I got from theater professionals or from others who were doing these things in their practice and who came into my classroom and we did it together. A couple things I invented myself, but mostly they're done from performance studies people or theater people or museum exhibit people, people who are doing theater in museums, and refined and refreshed and geared towards that. So the issue about one exercise is about going right back to what Thorsten was saying about the different perspectives. So you get students to read one text, the same text, and then they have to do a little script on it. They realize, oh, we emphasize different things in it, and then they have to move it and get on their feet and perform it. And then they're so different. So how can they be so different from the same text? Very elementary point about historical research, but one that actually challenges the notion that there's one way of reading this archival source, and there's a right way and a wrong way, and actually says, no, there's these different perspectives. Because why? And ask them, why are these different perspectives? Well, they're there because of your different subjectivities, your different experiences, your different sense of the past. And so to explore those differences. So that's why I didn't want to just, it was an afterthought actually, and I had to chuck out a chapter to make room for it, which I was a bit sad about. But it was an afterthought because I thought, well, I'm saying these things, but I'm not empowering anybody who isn't familiar with this to actually be able to do it in the classroom. And so I thought by sharing those with permission of all of the people who had been involved in initiating it, I'm giving people re-gifting what I had been gifted by these theater professionals and others to say, well, try this out in your classroom. You know, if you don't know how to do this or what to do, try this out. And I even include some evaluation criteria as well because we always get that question, Jimena, don't we? About how do you judge this and how do you evaluate it? So, and they're tried and true and they worked on the whole. So I felt confident in sharing them. Yeah.
I like
That's
this
why.
part very much, by the way. It's because the practices that we use need to be documented more often, and we have to talk about how we're experimenting ourselves and teaching, because these are the ways in which we learn how the old ways may be led into another way of doing things. For example, you could even use different media formats. If you want to learn about documentaries and how they work, you may want to check out the Sabathon Heavy Metal History channel on YouTube.
Yeah.
Because their
Yeah.
metal band is mocking up kind of a documentary studio set and talks about history in ways that makes you learn about how history channels do the same thing.
Right.
You can just check out the 11 DVDs from Drunk History from the US, which
Right.
they do the very same thing by doing like theatrical performance and reenactment parts on a
Yeah.
very stupid kind of telling stories, but you learn how this function and how the audiences learn how to see these things without even reflecting on it.
Yeah.
Another question related, well, thank you both for your answers. Another question related to the book. The book ends with the sentence, historians are, after all, the dramaturgs of the past. This resonates with anyone who has worked in theater and other forms of performance like reenactments, but for those who haven't, can you say more about what you mean by this?
Yeah, it's about the construction element, I think, that the constructivism that Thorsten was referring to and Kira gave an example of that. This actually came to be I didn't know what a dramaturg was until I joined the theater company, and there was this person beside me who was called the dramaturg, and their job was to do historical research, actually, to empower the actors with some historical research and put pictures up of various things. And the first time I walked into the theater, I was looking at, well, that's from the 19th century and this is from the 12th century, and what's the connection here? And you know, I'm the historian, I'm saying you can't do that, you know, this, but it was about swords, or it was about, headdresses or something. But then they do a little historical research, but it was all factual. And it wasn't historiographical at all. And I'd say, well, yeah, that's sort of true, but it's actually uncertain because there's different points of view on this. So I realized that the dramaturg was sort of like a historian, but not at all like a historian. And so we were invited, the dramaturg I worked with for many years, we were invited to the inaugural Theatre Studies conference, grad conference at the University of Ottawa, to just talk about our work together. And I don't know who came up with that phrase, whether it was me, whether it was her. I suspect it was the whole group that came up with this notion that I was a dramaturg too, but I was a dramaturg of the past. And this was back in 2012 or whatever. And I've thought about that thing that we collectively came to. And it's partly that it goes right back to the fact that we're not in a process of retrieval. We're in a process of creation. And that creativity is about negotiating within ourselves how we tell the stories. It's an internal discussion. It's a discussion with our audience. It's a discussion with the dead who ghost what we're doing. We're often, having that discussion, that we're curating the past, not retrieving it, and that we need to embrace that. And that is what dramaturgs do, is that what works for you, what works for the source, what works for the history, what works for the director, what works for the audience, what works for the actors. That's what the dramaturg does, is sort of pulls all this together. And I realize that's what I do, but the past is my playground, and so that's what I meant by that it's what works for everyone, what works for everything. It's realizing the blending or the blurring between facts and fiction, between creativity and being more inventive about the archive. And I think historians do this, and that was the phrase to it. I just don't think we embrace it or we actually admit it, and I think that saying that helps. Anyway, that's where it comes from. Yeah, and I suspect, Thorsten, you've heard that too from other people, or thought it yourself.
Yeah, sure. And I want to add the curatorial work as part of that too. So we combine kind of curating and dramaturg work in
Right.
one person, and we don't admit it. And there's one thing, and we talked about that early on in another conversation, is that there's a text from the theater that actually embraces that, which is Bertolt Brecht's Street Scene.
Right. Yeah.
Where he can, I don't know if you know the text. I put the link in here because it's online. It's old. So where he just makes an example for epic theater by using something we as historians know. We have some event, and then he talks about how this event can be transformed into something else. And this adds very much to what David just says. And I embrace the idea of having this curatorial idea on the one hand, checking the material we want to use, collecting it, and then presenting it in a certain way, and then make it work for everyone, which is the dramaturg part of it.
Yeah.
Thank you. I also remind the audience, if you have a question, please feel free to just ask it. Thorsten, I have a question for you. Maybe it's too soon, but I'm just going to ask it. Also building about David was saying about things that work and do not. What's your feeling about the masters? What do you think is working? What do you think is not working? How do you see it in the future? What are your future projects related to that?
Yeah, maybe I should just leave the room and let Chris do the telling here, because Chris is one of our students in the master. But I can just give some first expressions. So our master started in the last fall, so it's the first semester that just went by. And what I think really works good is that we have different fields of study where the people come from. So what we opened up our master's program for all kinds of disciplines you come from. You can even be a psychologist if you want to do a master in public history in Hamburg, because we think that past-related narrating happens in psychology too. Why not? I mean, every therapist knows that, and we all know that. So we have people from different backgrounds, and they. My feeling is, Chris, correct me if that's wrong, but my feeling is that they are now in that phase of being transformed, in a liminal phase, kind of being transformed into this openness that we want to have for them. So people are starting to think about their master thesis in late first semester, which is awesome. And first people come to us saying that, oh, how can we maybe take this 1619 project from the US about colonialism and a new form of narrative to the German experience, and then do kind of a performative thing using kind of newspapers for that. And yeah, well, let's try it out. You can, why not? So my feeling is that the creativity of the students is high. Their willingness to go new ways and try new paths is high. But sometimes they are afraid that this may lead into disgrace because the disciplines are too hard in their judgments. We still have seminars where the idea is that if nobody cries, it's a bad class. And I don't think that's the way to do it. So this discouragement that happens in many classes and many BA programs, we want to stop that. We want people to have exactly what David says. If you are touched, if you are engaged, and if you need to cry in class, go ahead. This is something that we have learned not to do. And I had my first tears in a workshop with theater people. Of course I had, because their emotions are okay. And this is something that we need to relearn. So my feeling is that it's a way to go, but students know and they feel if the teaching person and the people who grade them are open, they feel more encouraged to try out things they haven't tried out before. And maybe that's my first say on that. But we need to talk next year, maybe, and then we invite students and they can tell you.
Okay, thank you. And David, on reflection on your book, are there things you think didn't quite work as you wished, or things you have done differently?
Yeah, well, as I said, I had to chuck a chapter out to make space for the classroom exercises, and I got to the point where I just like, it's got to go. I've got to send this into the daycare and stop being the parent. And I had a chapter on site-specific theater, site-specific performance, so the relation of space. I had a student called Emily Keyes who wrote an amazing thesis on and a script based on a woman who died in our local jail, our Ottawa jail, and we had it was scripted on site, and the actors came out of the cells when they were doing it, and it was on the site of the old jail. And I don't want to spoil it because she might be writing something on this, but we actually had a ghost experience ourselves. At the end of it, after the audience had gone, we were sitting there with the theater person, and we all individually saw some movement across and we just looked at each other and said, "Did you see?" Oh yeah, we left fairly quickly. But it was, that's that power of the space in which things are performed. I wish I'd written more about that. It's a bit in there, but it's not as much there. And the difference between staging something in a performance place and staging something in the place that something happened, or in an open space, I think is there's a conversation there that didn't happen in the book. As much as I would have liked. Yeah, I think there's that. I think also maybe being a historian who's trained in the Western tradition and then encountering these other ways of storytelling through dance or through drumming or in Brazil or West Africa, and the puppetry that I chose to put on the cover of the book. I'm not part of that culture. I'm not part of those. I don't speak those languages, and even if I did, I'm still not part of those cultures. So, and I make that quite clear in the book that this is my journey as a person encountering these. I'm not actually claiming any authority when I'm talking about them, but I know that there's with the puppetry, I've wrestled with it for for ages about the one that's actually on the cover that Jimena showed. So the Wayang puppets, where they're making contemporary references and bringing a lot of contemporary world things to a very formalized tradition, and they're challenging it but having to conform to this thing. I'm not sure if that's public history or whether it's doing history in public, and I'm not sure what the difference between those two things is. So I wrestle a little bit with that, and I think that's what I think might not work quite so well for me as I thought it worked when I wrote it. But that's the joy of writing something and putting it out there, is that you think, yeah, that doesn't work. And so why did I think it worked then, and am I a little unsure about it now? But that opens up conversations and discussions, and that's why you perform, and that's why you want audiences and you want to engage it. But yeah, but I really like the cover, so that's
It's
I'm
a great
happy
cover.
about. Yeah, so
And
you know,
my last question for both of you, thinking of our online audience, people who are going to see the video in their own time, do you have words of encouragement for students or practitioners just to let go and try new things and leave their fears of writing history in a traditional manner a little bit aside?
Yeah, sure. Go, do it. So I would say you still have to learn things if you want to kind of have your grades in academia. Then you have to learn your rules and regulations, follow them, and do it. But it's only one set, and if you have learned that, and if you manage to work with that set, there are so many others that may be more interesting for you, that may be more important to you and to do your things. So learn the things and then do your stuff. I mean, it does matter. I don't want the next 25 stories of some guy who just knows rules and regulations of academic historiography. I mean, yeah, we can do that. Why not? If that's your thing, go for that. But if you want to say something differently, it may reach us out to other audiences that are not in the discourse now. And we need more people in discourse and less out. Maybe that's an idea that I want to encourage people to follow that path.
yeah, I fully agree with that. I mean, be courageous too. You need those foundational things. You need to play those games, as it were, but be courageous, follow your instinct, follow your passion, and also have joy. I think we've lost some of the joy of doing history work, and I think that's that joyfulness in it, and that it's not just happy joyfulness. It can be really challenging and gloomy joyfulness, but that the richness of doing history work, we need to get back to that and embrace that, and I think that's really important for. That would be a message I would say, and don't let things get suppressed. Play the game if you need to, which you will do, but also let those other things happen.
Yeah, if there's history wars, you
yeah.
have to know what you want to fight for.
Yeah.
Sarah, please.
Yeah.
Your question.
Thank you. This was incredibly insightful. Thank you both. I am curious to hear from both of you if there's a spectrum, say, of the traditional monograph and the dance. Where do you see, from the lens of performativity, something like a public talk that is open to any publics done on a Saturday afternoon in a library?
Mm-hmm.
I have questions.
You're laughing first. Yeah.
Yeah, because I have questions. What library? What's the topic? Who can go there? Do you need to have a car? Is it in Milwaukee where you can walk if you live downtown? I don't know. So if it comes to analysis, I would say, okay, let's see. What is the theater? What is the stage? What are the audiences that can go to that performance? What are the actors that are involved? What is the setting, and how does the script play out? So what do the people that arrange that event want to do with it, and how does it work out? So this would be a kind of a performance analysis of the thing that you are doing there. The other thing, if I have some point to make, I would say, okay, who do I want to talk to? Who do I want to address? And who do I get these people in? And if they don't come to libraries very often, unless it's cold, which people do at times, and it's good that libraries are still open to these people, you may want to have a certain way of communication that these people find their way to the event. And if that's too complicated, don't choose the library.
Yeah, yeah. I think if I flip that perspective, when I began doing public history work without knowing that I was doing public history work when I was in England, I would teach an evening class on history in the movies, and I would do public talks. I'd go to various places, and I was trained as an Elizabethan 16th century historian. So I would be talking about Elizabeth I and, the court of Henry VIII and all that stuff. And I do it sometimes on site in places and my colleagues would always regard that as popularizing the past. So, and here's David. Here's David. He likes doing that, so he'll do the popular bit for the department, and the assumption there is that I was dumbing it down, that it wasn't very valid, that it was just entertainment, that it was not very productive, and certainly it had absolutely no value to me as a historian, right? As an academic. In doing all those things, I found all of those were incorrect assumptions that that it was. And again, with each of the performances, and I did regard them as performances, I scripted it carefully. I thought about my audience. I reacted differently. I would do the same talk 8 different ways. This is nerdy. I was working on Elizabethan parliaments. That was my PhD, Elizabethan parliamentary history. And I'm going around giving talks because in England, there's a big interest in Elizabethan parliamentary history in a way that there isn't anywhere else in the world. But so I would give talks on the monopolies debate of 1601 and get an audience of 40 or 50 people who were interested in that. But everywhere it was, as Thorsten says, was it in site? Was it off site? Was it in a library? Was it in a classroom? Was it in a school? All of those things. Was the audience young and school kids or wanting to do their A-levels or doing their A-levels? Or was it retirees in a pensioner's home? All these things mattered, and they changed my performances. They changed what I said, and they changed the history that I told. And then I began to realize, there isn't just this one thing that I'm doing. I'm doing as many things. But now, of course, I don't know if this is true everywhere, but in Canada now, with neoliberalism in universities, that wouldn't be regarded as a bad thing in popularizing the past. That would be regarded as outreach and validating the sort of neoliberal, yes, you're reaching out to the community. So you get much greater validation now because, yes, you're doing outreach. And that's important for universities to show that, particularly publicly funded universities, that you are relating to the community. But it's still that top down, outward in. And what we've been talking about today is the inside version of knowing from doing, and I think that's where there's these two worlds collide in a way, and so now when I do those public performances, they're very different from the way I used to do them in the 90s in England. I do a lot more audience engagement. I do a lot of So it's funny, Thorsten, that you mentioned parking, because I was speaking at a museum and I began the talk talking about parking. How much did you have to pay for parking? Because the museum said, this is outreach. We want people to come into the museum. And then they charge them $12 for parking, And so I said, well, let's talk about parking and audience, and that was my way of getting into public history, what public history was, by talking about that and who audiences are. So, yeah, thanks for the question. I've got nice memories.
I want to add just one small thing here. If you want, sometimes we want to give marginalized peoples and groups the stage to make their points. And the first thing there would be to ask these groups and people if they want to be staged like that, because sometimes they don't, and that's an important thing to do first, because especially for me as a mid-European white male and professor, I once had to do a moderation for a feminist music staging stuff thing. Then just all the women there became to just make their points, let's say it as that, which is great. But there was a point where I was asking myself, should I now intervene in this process of sorting things out? And my answer was no, because I, as a white male, should not, as a professor on a stage, just intervene in a discourse that has just been started. But then people complain that I did not do that because I'm a white male and a professor should do that. So maybe we should talk exactly about that. Parking, is that a stage you want to have? Is that my stage? What is my stage? What is my theater? Is it even the theater I want? Or should I just take the approach and say, no, it's not. I will do an audio guide on that. Why not? And then I leave some traces in the public sphere, and then people can engage with that. So maybe that's it. I don't know.
Yeah. So let's leave the public library room and go walk about.
Okay, we have a few more minutes for comments, remarks, doubts, anything you want to add, Thorsten or David, or I don't know, criticism, anything you want. I have to say that I find this very encouraging, at least for me, in my own teaching and in my own practice, because I have been telling my students that they have to like what they do. And when they enjoy their products of whatever assignment is, are actually better. Instead of telling them you have to write a 10-page essay about, I don't know, historiography in, well, the Cold War, they would be so boring and it will be dreadful for them. But if they can choose what can they do, actually results are better. So I'm really gonna keep doing what I'm doing after reading the book and also using the exercises.
Okay.
So
I have
Kira.
if we don't mind. And this is going to be like a very self-interested question. I am I'm curious because especially Thorsten, you brought up the point on when we're doing history, we're doing it in a particular moment in time and it's being interpreted based on present needs. So I'm wondering, as a performing historian, if you ever think about future in your practice and the relationship between past, present, and future.
The future is very complicated for historians, as you know. But everything we do is kind of future related. So if we do things as historians in the here and now, and we relate to the past to do our point in the here and now, we don't do it just for the past and for the here and now. We always do it because we want some development in some direction in the future. So these three layers are always kind of interacting. They belong together. They're kind of entangled for me. So this is one point, saying that everything we do leads into some direction. And I'm thinking about the future kind of as a political citizen in my communities, where I engage as someone who needs to pay rent, someone who sees that environments are changing in our neighborhoods because people can't afford to live there. We have affordability crisis all in the Western Hemisphere, at least. We have some other crises as well in other parts. We have wars. So everything I do kind of relates to that. This is being self-sufficient and clear about my own position. And this is what Jimena asked earlier. What about our own subjectivities? They are always related to the future. Another thing that really interests me, so this is maybe some future research, is to the climate crisis and the way activists engage with that is in a specific mode, because they are talking about the future, but they are using means of telling about the past that will be in a certain future. So in German, we have a certain case for that, how to use this grammatically. Other languages have too. So we are always using this mode of talking about the past, even if we are talking about the future. And this is something that interests me very much. So how should we act now to prevent that in the future? We need to say that we should have prevented it by doing A. So this is a mode of doing history future related. And so these three layers, future, present, past, are always entangled. And this is something we need to reflect more theoretically to understand how we engage with our communities. If we're doing history, why are we doing this, and where does it lead to? And this is also true for the analysis part of our jobs. So if we are checking the executive orders of President Trump concerning the Smithsonian, it's not only in the here and now and concerning how to use the past in that museums, it's also about how should our history be told in the future. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but it has some perspectives how I think about the future. And of course, last thing, past ideas of the future are very interesting. How are people thinking
Yeah.
about the future? I mean, if you go to the Huntsville Space Center, into the museum, the first thing you see in a display is Jules Verne's ideas about traveling to the moon. That's interesting because this institution is telling their past by using an idea about the future in a fiction format. That's awesome.
Right.
This
Yeah.
is, we should use that more often.
That is awesome. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So if there's no more questions or comments, I would just like to thank very much David and Thorsten for this very encouraging and excellent talk. What comes next is that I will process the video and send it to you, and I will circulate on social media. I won't give your information for anybody who asks me, and instead I will ask you and then give your emails if you authorize that. And I would like you also to continue to be aware of the IF Explorers events this year, that we are going to have also great guests in the future. So thank you very much for being here.